Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Almost midday here. Big Ben is there, covered in scaffolding, almost entirely now. Just the face can be seen there. Prime Minister's questions on its way in a few minutes. Laura Kuenssberg is already with us in the studio. Laura, all the stories swirling around Westminster, ranging from inappropriate behaviour to sexual harassment to rape. Hard for PMQs to avoid that, I would have thought.
Absolutely, and I would be surprised if they avoid this issue, because not just because it is what everybody is talking about in Westminster, but also because it is something that is extremely important. And as days go by, I do think we have entered a new phase in all of this. You know, from time to time, stories like this have bubbled up, but there has always been a real reticence among some of the victims of this kind of behaviour who work across the road to come forward. And I do think potentially, particularly with Bex Bailey coming forward yesterday, so honestly, that we're starting to see a change in that. And therefore, I think all of the political parties, they're not just nervous about what's going to come up in their own party when the rock is lifted up, what crawls out from underneath, but I think they are also all concerned to try to get this right now, actually to try to make this a moment and to make the Parliament of 2017 the Parliament that actually created a change here. And I expect by the end of the day, I think we will see more proposals from the Labour Party about tightening up their procedures again.
The key word there for me is jumped out is 2017.
Yeah.
That it's only 2017 that we're now getting round to this.
Yes.
And the understandable reluctance of women in particular to come forward, and you could understand from what happened from Bex Bailey's experience, but the consequence of that is it allowed Westminster and the political parties and government not to do too much about it, not to put procedures in place.
Yes, I think that's been part of the, I mean, there have been lots of issues here, but one of the problems has been that when people don't speak up, it's firstly very hard for the political parties to know really what they're dealing with. If it's not open and not discussed, then for years actually it's been very difficult to tell what the true scale of this kind of thing is. Everybody who works around here has heard these kinds of allegations from time to time. But until people were willing to put things on the record or to start putting things on the record, it's very hard to know genuinely how widespread an issue this is. And we have also seen, and this is an issue also for young men as well as for young women, when these issues have bubbled up before, there are people who feel when they've tried to speak out, they have been penalised.
Yes.
And sometimes they've been the ones who slinked away from Westminster. And part of the issue here is that loyalty is one of the currencies around here. Now, that's not just the whips like to hang on to awkward information to try to get people to vote the way they want to, but that's also because Westminster attracts, quite understandably, ambitious people who want to come here, who quite often come here and want to change the world and they want to make a difference. So do people want to start their career being pointed to as some kind of troublemaker with some kind of way that they are going to be attacked themselves? And since Bex Bailey came forward yesterday, I've talked to a couple of people who have been affected by this kinds of issue who have told me that that was in their minds. They feared that they wouldn't be believed, and they feared that they themselves would be damaged in terms of their own futures if they actually spoke up. The other thing that's a structural issue is that MPs employ their staff directly. We're not talking about a traditional business here. So how do you complain about the boss to the boss?
Because there's no big HR department.
There's no big HR department, there's no real structure. And I think that's one thing, when these things have bubbled up over the years, Parliament has never quite grasped that. Now, there have been various proposals. Should IPSA, the expenses regulator, should they be the ones who are in charge of it? There were ideas before that David Cameron considered, and the 1922 committee wasn't particularly keen on having some kind of corporate behemoth that suddenly employed a couple of thousand researchers. But I think, as we've seen from Bex Bailey's story and from others that I have heard, this is not just an issue in Parliament. No. This is an issue in the culture of politics. I suppose in the way that it is also in other industries.
Yes.
I mean,
but also in the political parties too.
But in the parties. But there is something different here because Westminster works on power. And loyalty is one of the things that kind of oils the wheels. And when people really, really care about their party, they've sometimes been persuaded to hold things back for the greater good.
Miss Bailey seems to have done. But it is interesting the way things work, though, Laura, that if this is a watershed year.
And it may not be.
And it may not, I understand that.
But it may be.
If it is, how our society works now, it takes the scandal surrounding a Hollywood mogul to result in potential major change in behaviour in Westminster.
And that is quite something. There is, there is, and I would also say that certainly, you know, I've been sort of rounding about Westminster for nearly 20 years now, and I think most people would concur that, you know, the atmosphere is less secretive. It is less full of awful things going on in dark corridors. I think it has improved, if you want to use that word. But are there things that people have carried around with them for a long time that they felt they haven't been able to share? Yes, absolutely.
Quite fundamental things like the whip's office in all the parties, particularly the two major ones, having data on bad behaviour by somebody, but not using it to bring justice, keeping it to kind of keep them in line.
And I was a government whip in 2013, and that is not true. And actually, there were attempts made in 2013 to set up a cross-party, independent complaints procedure.
We'll come back to that, because I'm afraid we'll come back to that, because we've got to go straight over to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that members across the House will have been appalled by last night's cowardly terrorist attack in New York. Our thoughts are with all those affected, and we stand united with the people of New York. Mr. Speaker, members on both sides of the House have been deeply concerned about allegations of harassment and mistreatment here in Westminster. This demands a response, and that is why my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, has been meeting with her counterparts, and we are hopeful that all sides can work together quickly to resolve this. And I've written to all party leaders, inviting them to a meeting early next week so we can discuss a common, transparent, independent grievance procedure for all those working in Parliament. We have a duty to ensure that everyone coming here to contribute to public life is treated with respect. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dennis Skinner. Is the Prime Minister aware there's been some very powerful research done on the question of high-speed rail? What it says is that in the leafy suburbs of the south, the first 140 miles, 30% of it has been dedicated to tunnelling to avoid knocking houses down. Yet in the north, we are now told that the percentage is only 2% for the whole of the north. Why? Because HS2 says it's too costly, knock the houses down. Will she arrange for a meeting with people from my area in order to avoid another 30 houses being knocked down in Newton, part of Bolsover? And isn't it high time that this government stop treating our people like second-class citizens?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that I'm sure the Department of Transport will be happy to look into the question that he has raised. But of course, HS2, the reason why we're doing HS2 is that it is important to increase the capacity of the railway lines going through to the north. This will be a very important contribution to the United Kingdom economy. And I can assure him, if he looks at everything that this government has done, with the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine, the significant investment in infrastructure across all parts of the country. This is a government that wants to ensure this is a country that works for everyone.
Ms. Raghani.
I want to join the Prime Minister and add that my thoughts, along with Wilden's, are with New Yorkers. The shocking scenes in New York will have brought back awful memories of terrorist attacks here. And as we degrade and destroy Daesh, at its base, it will export its death cult ideology. Will my right honourable friend urge our international partners to join with us in delivering the recent UN resolution to investigate and prosecute Daesh terrorists so we can hold them to account for their vile crimes?
Yes, well, my honourable friend raises a very important point, and it is important that we ensure that we have a complete response to this issue of the threat of terrorism. That does involve dealing with the problem at source. It also involves dealing with terrorism wherever it occurs. But our message is very clear that our values will prevail, that the terrorists will not win. But as we do this, we do need to ensure that we work, as she has said, with international partners. We want to try to make sure that there is in Syria and Iraq, that we develop safe spaces as they re-emerge from this terrorist threat which has been on their streets but has also obviously affected us here and elsewhere across the world. But crucially, and we've done a lot of work in this, in helping those actually in situ to be able to gain evidence that can be used to ensure that anybody who is involved in the horrors of attacks that we see, that anybody who's involved in horrors of attacks actually can be properly brought to justice.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the question of the sex harassment allegations that the Prime Minister quite rightly referred to, just to put on the record, I'm happy to meet with the Prime Minister and all party leaders to discuss this. We need better protections for all in this House. This House must involve workplace trade unions in that, but it's also incumbent on all parties to have robust procedures in place to protect and support victims of sexual abuse and harassment. And I join with the Prime Minister in sending our solidarity to the people of New York and their Mayor, Bill de Blasio, for the appalling terrorist attack that took place yesterday. I hope, Mr. Speaker, the whole House will join me in paying tribute to two former Labour colleagues who sadly passed away this week. Candy Atherton, the member for Falmouth and Camborne, and Frank Doran, the member for Aberdeen North. Both did enormous good work at opposite ends of the UK to diligently represent their communities and constituencies. They will be sadly missed by all of us, particularly in the Labour Party, who they served so well for their entire lives. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the Labour government intervened through HMRC to shut down an Isle of Man scheme used to import yachts into the European Union and thus avoid tax. A similar scheme has recently been exposed relating to the import of business jets into the Isle of Man. So can the Prime Minister assure the House that HMRC investigates these new allegations diligently?
The Right Honourable Gentleman has made a number of references in his question, and I will address all of them. On the first point, it is absolutely essential, and he is right, that we have processes, that political parties have processes to deal with allegations of misconduct. Also, that obviously we have the Ministerial Code and proper investigations take place against the Ministerial Code where that is appropriate. But I believe it is also crucial for everybody working in this Parliament, be they working for a Member of Parliament, for the House authorities or a journalist working in this Parliament, that there are proper processes in this Parliament for people to be able to report misconduct and for that to be dealt with. And I think that is very important, and I'm grateful to him for saying that he will meet with me, and I hope other party political leaders. I see the leader of the SNP is nodding his head at this point, to look at this particular issue. Can I also join him in paying tribute to both Frank Doran and Candy Atherton? Frank Doran was first elected in 1987. He served 2 separate terms as the MP for Aberdeen, chaired the Administration Committee for 5 years, was a tireless campaigner for safety in the oil and gas industry, and I'm sure everybody will recall the commitment with which he served in this House and join me in offering condolences to his family and friends. And Candy Atherton, of course, was first elected in 1997 when I was first elected. She served for 8 years as a Member of Parliament, but she was a strong campaigner for women's rights and disability issues and continued to champion those causes on Cornwall Council after she had left this House. And once again, I'm sure members across the House will join me in offering my condolences to her family and friends. The Right Honourable Gentleman talks then about tax avoidance. I can assure him that where cases are referred to HMRC in relation to tax avoidance, they do take those seriously, they do look into those measures seriously. We have taken action collectively as a government over the last few years, since 2010 when we first came in, and we've secured almost £160 billion in additional compliance revenues since 2010 through a number of measures that we have taken to ensure that we clamp down on tax evasion and avoidance.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, 957 business jets in the Isle of Man seems a bit excessive for any island anywhere, and I hope it's investigated and due tax is collected from those people that are trying to avoid it. Because estimates of the scale of tax dodging range from 34 billion, which is around the size of our school's budget, to 119 billion, which is the size of the NHS budget. The Isle of Man VAT avoidance allegations are part of a wider leak from the Bermuda-based law firm said to be on a similar scale to the Panama Papers. Will the Prime Minister commit the HMRC to fully investigate all evidence of UK tax avoidance and evasion from this leak and prosecute where feasible?
I had given the Right Honourable Gentleman an assurance in my first answer that HMRC does take these issues very seriously, does investigate and does take action, and where appropriate, tax loopholes are closed. What is important is that if we look at the record that we have, we see, I mentioned the 160 billion in additional compliance revenue since 2010. We've announced or implemented over 75 measures since 2010 to tackle tax avoidance and evasion. The Right Honourable Gentleman referred to one that had been done by the Labour government. We have been continuing to act on this particular issue, so we will be raising billions of pounds more as a result of that. But I reassure him, I think most people would recognise that HMRC actually does rather want to collect tax. That's its job, and it does look to make sure it can do so as much as possible.
Enemy Corbyn!
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's rather strange then that Britain reportedly has blocked a French-led proposal which would have placed Bermuda on the European Union tax haven blacklist. Perhaps the Prime Minister could explain why that would be the case. The Panama Papers exposed many wealthy individuals and big businesses who avoided tax through offshore trusts. Labour backs any necessary changes to toughen our laws against aggressive tax avoidance. And just yesterday, Mr. Speaker, we tried to strengthen legislation on beneficial ownership of trusts with amendments we placed to the Finance Bill. Why did the government vote against them?
Can I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that he raises the issue of the British Overseas Territories. In fact, this government has taken action in relation to those British Overseas Territories, action that was not taken by the previous Labour government. So this is, if he says to me that this whole question of tax evasion is something that needs to be constantly looked at and government needs to be prepared to act, then my answer is yes. We are, and we will.
Enemy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, there's a strange kind of pattern here, because in 2015 alone, Conservative members of the European Parliament voted against 5 reports to introduce methods of fighting tax avoidance and evasion. And last week, HMRC admitted that multinational companies avoided paying 5.8 billion taxes in 2016. And despite this, HMRC is currently cutting another 8,000 staff. So can the Prime Minister assure the House that in the upcoming budget, instead of more cuts to HMRC, they'll get more resources to tackle the scourge of aggressive tax avoidance and evasion?
I have reassured the Right Honourable Gentleman that HMRC is acting, has been acting since this Conservative Party came into government in 2010, and will continue to act. But of course, the Right Honourable Gentleman, in asking these questions, might want to reflect on why it was, before the dissolution of Parliament earlier this year, it was the Labour Party that stopped and refused to support tax avoidance, anti-tax avoidance and evasion measures brought forward by this government. His party stopped it.
Mr. Speaker, my question was, why Conservative MPs opposed what Labour was proposing yesterday. So, Mr. Speaker, last month's European Parliament Committee of Inquiry, set up in the wake of the Panama Papers, claimed that the UK is obstructing the fight against tax dodging and money laundering. And just last week, the EU's Competition Commissioner announced an inquiry into UK taxation rules that may have institutionalised tax avoidance by multinational corporations. Isn't the Prime Minister concerned that vital revenue is being lost to fund schools and hospitals? Will she change the rules in the budget?
Say to the right honourable gentleman, we have taken an extra £160 billion in additional compliance revenues since 2010. And he comments on measures that were being proposed this week. As I said in my previous answer, we would have had more tax evasion, anti-tax evasion measures in place if the Labour Party had not blocked them before the last election. This party in government has been not just acting in the UK. We have been working with the Crown dependencies, working with the British Overseas Territories, and we have been leading the world. It was a Conservative Prime Minister that put this on the agenda of the G7 and the G20 for international action against tax avoidance and evasion.
Mr. Speaker, if we are leading the world, perhaps she could explain how the amount of tax paid by the super-rich in income tax has fallen from £4.4 billion to £3.5 billion since 2009. Earlier this year, the Public Accounts Committee said the HMRC record of getting multi-millionaires to pay their taxes was, and I quote, dismal, and that the super-rich were getting help with their tax affairs that is not available to other taxpayers. Our schools' budgets are being cut. More people waiting longer for treatment. More people...
Order! We do tend to have large doses of this overexcitement every week, but I just give notice that, as usual, I'd like to get to the end of the order paper and to facilitate backbench inquiries as well. So members are eating only into their own time. I've got all the time in the world. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, since members opposite get so excited, I must say it again. Our schools' budgets are being cut. More people waiting longer for treatment on the National Health Service. More elderly and disabled not getting the social care they need. Does the Prime Minister think it is acceptable that when it comes to paying taxes, there's one rule for the super-rich and another for the rest of us?
The top 1% of earners in this country are paying 28% of the tax burden. That is the highest percentage ever under any government. And once again, the right honourable gentleman is wrong. Over the next 2 years, £2.5 billion extra is being put into our schools as a result of decisions taken by this Conservative government. But I'll tell him, he talks about spending on schools and hospitals. I'll tell him where the real problem lies. Today, we spend nearly £50 billion in payments on interest to those we have borrowed from as a result of the legacy of the Labour Party. That is more than we spend on the NHS pay bill. It is more than we spend on our core...
Order. The Prime Minister's answer will be heard. As I indicated, the question from the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, would be heard. And Mr Gapes, you are a senior and cerebral denizen of the House. The This excessive gesticulation is not good for you, man. Calm yourself. The Prime Minister.
We spend £50 billion on debt interest every year, payments to people we've borrowed from. That's more than the NHS pay bill, it's more than our schools budget, it's more than we spend on defence. That's a result of the economy we were left by the Labour Party in government. And what does the Right Honourable Gentleman want to do? He wants to borrow £500 billion more that would make the situation worse and mean even less money for schools and hospitals.
Tim Lawton!
Mr. Speaker, on August the 22nd, 2015, in my constituency, 11 men tragically lost their lives in the Shoreham Airshow disaster. Over 26 months later, no decision has been taken on criminal charges, and the coroner's inquest has been delayed again until November of next year. And the families of the victims have just had their application for exceptional case funding rejected by the legal aid agency, and they will likely be the only persons at the inquest not legally represented. Will my right honourable friend agree to look at this case again and to meet the families to ensure that they have proper access to justice in this exceptionally tragic case, which has a much wider public interest for safety at all airshows?
Well said. No, well, can I say to my honourable friend that he raises a very important issue, and I can fully understand the concerns of the families in relation to this. He talks about the timetable for decisions being taken. The Department of Transport has accepted the Air Accidents Investigation Branch's recommendation to commission an independent review, and they're working with the Air Accidents Investigation Branch to determine the exact scope of the review. And the Civil Aviation Authority has accepted all recommendations. So there is considerable work going on to learn the lessons from this disaster. But we are also obviously committed to ensuring that people where there is a public disaster, that people are able to have proper representation. And this is an issue that I will ask the Lord Chancellor to look at in relation to the question that he has raised.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks made by the Prime Minister when she talked about the zero tolerance that there has to be for bad sexual practices and behaviour? And I certainly commit my members to work with the government to make sure that we can have a system that we can be proud of, that will protect all members of the House of Parliament. Can I also pass on my condolences to the family and friends of Frank Norden for his untimely and sad death this week? Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister tell the House how much a working single parent can expect to lose because of the rollout of universal credit?
Can I first of all say to the honourable gentleman that I'm grateful to him for agreeing that he wants to work across the House on this important issue. If I may just say to him, though, he referred to sexual misconduct. I think what is important is actually that any processes that are put in place don't just look at sexual misconduct, but look at issues like bullying as well, because I think that is also important. He's raised the rollout of universal credit with me before, as he knows the reason why we've brought into place the universal credit is to ensure that people are encouraged into the workplace, and when they are in the workplace, they are able to keep more of the money that they earn. I believe that's an important principle. It underpins what we're doing and will continue to underpin what we're doing.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that new research shows that working single parents could lose an average of £1,350 per year because of the cuts to work allowances. Mr. Speaker, universal credit is fast becoming Theresa May's poll tax. The Prime Minister has a habit of U-turning. Will she U-turn one more time and fix the problems with universal credit?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, I've underlined the principle that lies behind universal credit, which I believe is a very important one. And that is why when we look at the support that is given to people, it isn't just about the support that they receive in financial terms on universal credit, it's also about the support that they receive to help them to get into the workplace, to ensure that they can actually meet the requirements of getting into the workplace, and that when they're in the workplace, they can keep more of the money that they earn. I think that is an important principle. We will continue to roll out universal credit, looking carefully at the implementation of universal credit as we do so, because we're doing this in a careful way over a period of time. But the important principle is that universal credit is a simpler system that ensures that people keep more as they earn more.
Mrs. Cheryl Gillen.
Mr. Speaker, in Chesham and Amersham, we are acutely aware that infrastructure is vital for economic success, particularly of other parts of the country. However, we still have areas that do not have access to high-speed broadband, and with the advent of electric vehicles, we're going to need to install an extensive charging network. Could the Prime Minister tell me what further action the government can take to ensure the timely completion of our broadband infrastructure, and what it can do to guarantee the rapid rollout of electric vehicle charging points so Buckinghamshire residents and businesses can not just bear the brunt and burden of infrastructure development, but can take advantage of the opportunities offered by modern technology?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right that we want to be able to make sure that we take the advantages that are offered by the modern technology. That's why these are issues that have been addressed in our industrial strategy and will continue to be addressed. And we recognise that when we talk about infrastructure in this country, actually increasingly the IT infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure, is part of that. It isn't just the physical roads and rails infrastructure. So we are investing £790 million in improving broadband. That takes our public investment to £1.7 billion. And we also, as she says, we are leading the world in the development of electric cars, and we need to ensure that we have those vehicle charging points. So we have put in place, and we're putting in place, grants and policy measures to ensure that we see those charging points so people can take advantage of those new vehicles.
Lyndon! Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister is serious about building a country that works for everyone, can she tell the House why under-25s are not included in the national living wage? And will she address the scandal that is a national minimum wage for apprentices of £3.50 per hour?
It's important that we have the national living wage. It was this party in government that introduced the national living wage. That has had an important impact on people, and obviously the national living wage continues to increase.
Fiona Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join with the local government minister's positive comments this week, welcoming the development of some family hubs? And will she encourage our excellent Conservative mayors and councils to be champions of these hubs, which can so improve the lives of children, including the most vulnerable children, by strengthening their families?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this point, and I think we all recognise the value of stable and strong families, and this is an issue on which she has a cause that she has championed through her time in this House, but also outside of this House as well, and I'm happy to join her in welcoming the development of family hubs, and I will certainly encourage Conservative mayors and councils across the country to be champions of those hubs.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister will be fully aware, my great city of Dundee has been repeatedly in the news last week. Dundee's launched its European Capital of Culture bid. It's now the world centre for pharmaceutical innovation, and the Wall Street Journal, no less, listed Dundee as one of the top 10 places to visit on earth, making it, and I quote, Scotland's coolest city. So wouldn't it be great if the Prime Minister today can finally tell the innovative, the creative and the cool people of Dundee and the surrounding area what precisely is the UK Government's date for delivering its full and fair share of the Tay City deal?
I apologise, I didn't hear the end of the... But I think what is important for the honourable gentleman is that and he stands up and speaks, waxes lyrically about his city of Dundee. I was, of course, he will recall, I was asked about the Dundee City of Culture bid last week and made the point that, of course, a number of places across the UK may be putting in those bids. But on the creative industries, I'm pleased to see the development of the V&A in Dundee as well. And the Tay City deal will be an important city deal for Dundee and the whole Tay area, as other city deals in Scotland have been for those where those have been agreed.
Chalk! Mr. Speaker. Cheltenham General's A&E is hugely valued by me and my constituents. We want to see it preserved and enhanced. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that local NHS managers who are currently formulating the draft STP must listen very carefully to the voices of my constituents and others in Gloucestershire and ensure that any proposals can truly command local support?
My honourable friend again raises an important issue, because we're very clear that proposals should be developed at a local level by local clinicians, but taking account of and listening to the views of local residents, of local constituents on those particular matters. I think this is important that local people are heard and can know that decisions have been taken in the light of any concerns that they raise. And I understand any proposals for urgent care developed by the Gloucestershire STP will in fact be subject to full public consultation in due course.
Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Government will today publish its first report detailing progress towards ratifying the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women following Aill Whiteford's Private Members Bill. After 5 years, hopefully, today's report signals that we won't have to wait long for ratification. However, women fleeing domestic violence don't have the luxury of time. So just as the Prime Minister has vowed to root out the sexual harassment and misogyny in this place, will she commit to long-term sustainable funding to ensure all women have somewhere safe to go when fleeing violence?
Good question.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that over the past few years, both when I was as Home Secretary and under my right honourable friend, the current Home Secretary, we have taken steps in relation to certain funding in relating to domestic violence, that funding is ring-fenced over a period of time, so there can be a greater certainty for organisations working in this area. There is much for us to do because, sadly, we still see domestic violence and abuse taking place. What is one of the other steps we're taking, of course, is to bring in new legislation in relation to domestic violence, which I hope will clarify the situation, but we need to address this across a wide variety of action.
Dowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How we treat our farmed animals is an indication of our civility as a nation. And we in this country have a record in which we can be rightly proud. Does my right honourable friend therefore share my concern that there have been reports that as a result of leaving the European Union there may be a relaxation of those standards? Can she take this opportunity to reassure me that that is not the case and that in fact we will seize the opportunity to improve standards and thereby enhance the reputation of British produce?
Well, I can assure my honourable friend, first of all, I can agree with him that we're proud to have some of the highest animal welfare standards in the world, and we want to continue to be able to have that reputation as a country where we have those high standards. So leaving the European Union is not going to change that. We remain committed to high animal welfare standards, and indeed, as my honourable friend says, that may give us an opportunity to enhance those standards so we can further show people the reputation that this country has as somewhere where they can be safe and secure in the knowledge of the conditions in which their food has been prepared.
Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that 4 million children in our country are growing up in poverty, and that number has risen. 2/3 of those children are from working families. Does she still seriously believe that the introduction of universal credit will bring that number down?
I'm pleased to see that the number of children in absolute poverty has actually come down under this government. But of course, we need to be aware of the impact of decisions that we have. We are looking carefully at the implementation of universal credit, but I continue and I will repeat the point that I made in response to the question from the leader of the SNP, which is that the point of universal credit, it's more straightforward, it's a simpler system, but also it helps people to get into the workplace and ensures that they keep more of the money that they earn, and I think that is important.
Kevin Hollin-Rake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's industrial strategy makes the historic commitment for a fairer distribution of infrastructure spending across the regions. This is our roads, our railways and digital networks. In advance of the White Paper, would my right honourable friend confirm this commitment and to a rebalancing of our economy by more investment spending in the regions, not least, Mr. Speaker, in Yorkshire?
Well, my honourable friend stands up well for his county and for his constituency on this matter, but I'm very happy to confirm to him that we will maintain that commitment in our forthcoming Industrial Strategy White Paper, because we do want to see a fairer distribution of infrastructure spending across the country. And we want that because we know that infrastructure investment is important to unlocking economic opportunities and economic growth and productivity in our towns, our villages and our cities. And we, of course, have backed this this with ambitious commitments to increase our spending on infrastructure by 50% over the next 4 years. But I can assure him we will be looking at that infrastructure spending across the whole country.
Lisa Nandy.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for her opening words about the horrific revelations this week. But can I say to her that 3 years ago, I brought evidence to her in this House that whips had used information about sexual abuse to demand loyalty from MPs. I brought that information to her in this House, and I warned her at the time that unless real action was taken, we risked repeating those injustices again today. On 3 occasions, I asked her to act, and on 3 occasions, she did not. So can I ask her, in this of all weeks, for the 4th time, will she finally take concrete action to tackle this?
I will, of course, look back at the questions that the Honourable Lady has said that she raised with me in this House. I assume she raised those with me when I was Home Secretary. I will say to her that I am very clear that the Whip's office, I hope this goes for all Whip's offices across this House, should make clear to people that where there are any sexual abuse allegations that could be of a criminal nature, that people should go to the police. It is not appropriate for those to be dealt with by Whip's offices. Those should go to the police. That continues to be the case. As I say, I will look at the questions that she raised with me, but I'm very clear that we will take action against those where there are allegations that we see and the evidence is there that there has been misconduct. But can I just say to the Honourable Lady, I hope we will all send a message from this House today that we want people in this place to be able to feel confident to bring forward cases, and we need to ensure that those cases are dealt with in a way that people can have confidence on both sides that they will be properly investigated. That means, and I want to see, a good process within this Parliament so that people feel they do not have to go to a party political process in order to have their allegations considered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my constituency of Aldershot is the home of the British Army and home to many thousands of servicemen and women who are loyal, resolute and steadfast in their service to the Crown. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree, when her very busy schedule allows, to visit the Aldershot garrison, to meet with servicemen and women and to thank them for their service?
Well, can I first of all assure my honourable friend that we recognise that the men and women of our armed services serve with great distinction and loyalty, and we are all grateful to them for the service that they give to this country. And that's why we are committed to maintaining 2% of our GDP being spent on defence. He very kindly invites me to visit his constituency, and I will be very happy to do so if my diary allows.
Sir Vince Cable.
A few days ago, the Chancellor told the House that the government could not afford to borrow £50 billion to invest in housing because of the burden on the next generation. The Community Secretary says that the government must borrow £50 billion because of the burden on the next generation of unaffordable housing. Can she adjudicate?
I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, there is no need to adjudicate on this matter. The government absolutely agrees that it is necessary for us to ensure that we are building more homes across this country. That we have already announced policies to enable that to happen. We've had the number of proposals that were set out in the Housing White Paper. I was very pleased to announce the extra £2 billion for affordable housing at our party conference, and the extra £10 billion in the Help to Buy scheme, which genuinely helps people to get their first foot on the housing ladder. We are seeing more houses being built under this government, and we will continue to see more houses being built under this government.
Chris Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, in Llangamach Wells in my constituency, a horrific farmhouse claimed the lives of a father and 5 young children. This has had a devastating effect, not just on the family, but on the tight-knit community that surround it. Would my right honourable friend join me, and indeed this House, in sending our sympathies to the family of the bereaved and also to the villagers in the town of Llangamach? along with praising the outstanding work of our emergency services who've dealt with this appalling tragedy with true dedication and professionalism.
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that he's raised what I know is a very tragic case, and I'm sure that everybody across this whole House will want to join with him in sending condolences to the family and friends of those affected by the fire. This was indeed a terrible tragedy that took place, and as he said, it isn't just the family themselves that have been affected, but the local community as well. And I know that the emergency services did sterling work, and I'm also pleased to commend the work that they did and their bravery and professionalism in dealing with this issue. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Wales, has spoken to the police, and they will remain in touch over the coming days. But once again, our emergency services do an amazing job protecting us. We see this in so many instances. They never know when they're going to be called out to such a tragic incident.
Ben Bradshaw.
Mr. Speaker. With today's news that the Electoral Commission is investigating Arron Banks, the main financial backer of Brexit, along with the significant British connections being uncovered by the American Justice Department Special Counsel Robert Mueller, investigating Russian interference in the US presidential election, will she assure me that the UK government and all its agencies are cooperating fully with the Mueller investigation, or will do so if asked?
Say to the right honourable gentleman that we take very seriously issues of Russian intervention or Russian attempts to intervene in electoral processes or in the democratic processes of any country, and we would do so for any other states that were involved in trying to intervene in elections. We do, of course, work closely with our United States partners, and I can assure him that as part of that relationship, we do cooperate with them when required.
Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month I was in the Kurdistan region in Iraq, and I refer the House to my declaration of members' interests. But I saw people's enthusiasm for independence and a fresh dialogue with Baghdad. The subsequent military actions against the Peshmerga by Iranian-backed militia and the Iraqi army are wholly unjust and completely unacceptable. Will the Prime Minister accept that the Peshmerga and the Kurdistan region, to whom we owe so much, both for resisting Daesh when the Iraqi army dumped their weapons and ran, and also for helping to keep our own streets safe, remain vital to our security, and can she do all she can to encourage a resolution based on full respect for the Iraqi constitution and the democratic will of the Kurdish people?
Can I say to my honourable friend that we are working, and it's right that we're working with our international partners in the region to defeat Daesh together with the global coalition. Daesh is losing territory. The action that's being taken is having an impact on it. Its finances have been hit, its leadership is being killed, and its fighters are demoralised. But we do want to see political reconciliation in Iraq and a political settlement to the Syria conflict to deny Daesh safe space and prevent their re-emergence. He raises a particular point in relation to Iraq and to the Kurdistan region. And can I say to him that we have always been clear as a government that any political process towards independence should be agreed with the government of Iraq. We want to see political reconciliation in Iraq, and we've been urging all parties to promote calm, to pursue dialogue, and to take this issue forward through dialogue.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An hour ago, the government published this report, The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power. It's a report of Right Reverend James Jones, which the Prime Minister herself commissioned to ensure that the pain and suffering of the Hillsborough families is not repeated. But, Mr. Speaker, given what we've heard in this session, and given the events surrounding the Grenfell Tower disaster, I think that I worry that the pain and suffering of the Hillsborough families is already being repeated. So can the Prime Minister commit her government to supporting both a duty of candour for all public officials and, as this report requires, an end to public bodies spending limitless sums providing themselves with representation which surpasses that available to families?
Obviously, the House will appreciate that I have to be careful what I say in relation to the Hillsborough issue because of the ongoing criminal proceedings, but I do want to pay tribute to the work of Bishop James Jones. Throughout the time, his work in chairing the independent panel, the work that he did as my advisor on this issue and working with the family forums, I think that he has done an excellent job. And once again, his report into the experiences of the Hillsborough families, which has been published today, as the Honourable Lady says, is important, and the government will need to look very carefully at the, I think it's 25 points of learning that come out of it, and we will want to do so, because I've always been very clear that the experience that the Hillsborough families had should not be repeated. That's why we have looked and we are committed to the concept of the public advocate, because we want to ensure that people have the support that they need, and it's important that we learn the lessons from Hillsborough. I was, as she knows, involved in making the decision that enabled the Hillsborough families to have legal support on a basis that I felt was fair in relation to the other parties involved in that inquest. And I can assure her that we will not forget the Hillsborough families who have been dignified throughout the many years that they have been waiting for justice. We will not forget them, we will not forget their experience, and we will ensure that we learn from that, and learn from that to improve the experience of others in the future.
Mark Francois. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I cheekily make another diary suggestion to the Prime Minister? If she could remain in the chamber for just a few moments after questions, she will hear my right honourable friend for Newbury introduce his Armed Forces Statute of Limitations Bill, which will provide protection to those brave service personnel who served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Like her, I too, and I'm sure the whole House, want to see the setting up of the Northern Ireland Executive. But would she agree with me, we cannot do that at the price of pandering to Sinn Féin and allowing a witch hunt for those people who served so bravely for so many years to uphold the rule of law.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to satisfy my honourable friend on the first point that he raised, but I can assure him I'm aware of the proposed legislation that my right honourable friend, the member from Newbury, is bringing forward. We all want to see a Northern Ireland Executive restored. We do recognise that this question of legacy issues is one that has been there throughout these discussions and continues in Northern Ireland. What I want to ensure is that any investigations that take place in the future take place in a fair and proportionate way, because our soldiers did save bravely, as my honourable friend said, in upholding the rule of law. But what is important is that we should never forget all those people who lost their lives at the hands of the terrorists in Northern Ireland. And it is important, as I say, that any investigations are conducted fairly and proportionately.
Are exercising their knee muscles, and there's no harm in that. And Tracy Brabin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister will be aware, self-employed people are not eligible for shared parental leave. This places the burden of childcare on the mum, denying fathers financial support and bonding time with the child. Has the Prime Minister seen the demands of the March of the Mummies, and can she give us assurances that she's prioritising this very urgent issue?
I say to the honourable lady, she does raise an important issue, and I'm happy to look at the point that has been made. But I would simply also remind her of this. The reason we have shared parental leave for anybody in this country is because when I was Minister for Women and Equalities, I actually ensured that that shared parental leave was introduced.
Kirsten Hare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of Angus, one of the big challenges as we leave the European Union is the uncertainty around the seasonal migrant workforce. Angus produces 30% of Scotland's soft fruit and welcomes over 4,000 seasonal workers every year. Would my right honourable friend agree that we need clarity on the new migration framework for the benefit of these loyal workers, for the prosperity of our British soft fruit industry, and to support our overall rural economy of our United Kingdom?
Well, my honourable friend raises an important point about the importance of supporting the rural economy across the whole of the United Kingdom. In relation to the seasonal agricultural workers scheme that she has referred to, obviously we will be, as we leave the European Union, we will be bringing forward new immigration rules which will enable us to have that control that we haven't had in the past for those coming from the European Union. But we recognise we need to do that in the national interest. We need to look at the needs of the labour market, and that's why my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has commissioned the Independent Migration Advisory Committee to look at the needs of the UK labour market and to further inform our work as we bring those new immigration rules in. And the issue she has raised is one they will look at.
Order.
And just after 10 to 1, Prime Minister's Questions finally comes to an end. Another record there. It began with Mr. Corbyn saying that he would be prepared to meet with the Prime Minister to try and get a general approach to dealing with sexual harassment and more serious matters in the Palace of Westminster and the political parties. And Lisa Nandy asked a very interesting question of the Prime Minister, saying that she had raised some issues of the whips using sexual misbehaviour to ensure compliance, as opposed to reporting it. I'm going to speak to her in a minute. But Mr. Corbyn surprised us all because he went on jets. Business jets, private jets, I think he was talking about, 950 of them in the Isle of Man, which would seem quite a lot for a small island, but apparently it's a way that the jets are bought that way to avoid VAT. And so Mr. Corbyn went in general on tax avoidance and tax evasion issues for all of the questions that he went through. And Laura, although it surprises, I think it's based on there's been another leak like the Panama Papers. We don't know if as big as that yet. This time based in Bermuda, a British Crown dependency, I think is what you call it. And the details of what are in this leak are coming out this weekend, including Panorama.
Well, there have been various stories reported around this issue already in various bits of the press in different parts of the world pertaining to a company called Appleby. So there was some kind of data leak about the business of what's been going on in terms of Bermuda. There's been a little bit of reporting in the Isle of Man and some pick-up in the British press in terms of this particular scheme over whether people have been using the purchase of business jets as basically an expensive way of avoiding having to pay VAT. Now, there's not very much information about this out there in the public domain yet. It's not clear to me whether or not Jeremy Corbyn was picking up on this because he knows something that the rest of us don't, or indeed it was over the fact that yesterday, and I think this is probably more likely, yesterday in the House of Commons, Labour tried to put down amendments to the finance bill, which was finally at its in its final stages, including an amendment from Stella Creasy, a prominent Labour backbencher, that was trying to crack down on a particular tax loophole, and the government didn't accept that. So look, this is absolutely home turf for Jeremy Corbyn. It's the kind of issue that he and his supporters are really, really passionate about. And I think that basically it was an opportunity for him to have a go at the government on this issue. I think, unfortunately, in terms of PMQs, it turned into a sort of tit for tat. You voted against this a couple of years ago. Well, you wouldn't vote for it last night. I think actually there was more heat than light, to be honest. But we'll see whether or not he has got more information.
What do you say to Mr. Corbyn's complaint you're not doing enough about tax avoidance?
Well, I think Jeremy's not looking at the measure which determines how much you're doing, which is the tax gap. So there's a calculation that says how much should we theoretically be collecting versus what we are collecting. And that gap has narrowed by 25% since 2010. And we now have the lowest tax gap in the world. So of course there's always more to be done, but I think for him to suggest that, you know, nothing is being done, he's just completely ignoring the fact that we have completely focused on reducing this tax gap and will continue to do so.
The Prime Minister said the government had collected an extra 160 billion because of enhanced compliance since 2010, and that the tax gap had got narrower and narrower and now was much lower than under Labour. So what's your response to that?
Well, my response is quite simply we have to push on further. You can get into the tit for tat, as that Labour in fact did raise more taxes through closing loopholes under a Labour government. What we want to do is to sort of move on and push further, and that's what we were trying to do. In the finance bill, which has been with us since March, trying to get the government to close even more tax loopholes, and we will continue to do that.
What's this complaint that you voted against doing some of this?
Well, no, what happened is that's not true. What happened is that the bill came to us before the election. The government called the election. They cut short the process for the scrutiny, and so it goes into the system of what goes through and what doesn't go through.
But in the wash, if we had passed, forgive me for interrupting, if we had passed those amendments, if we had passed those that law, we would have collected another 9 billion.
I'm going to interrupt you because Labour MP Lisa Nandy had probably one of the standout questions at Prime Minister's Questions when she asked Theresa May about whips using scandal to control MPs' behaviour, compliance to party policy. She's in the central lobby now. Lisa Nandy, what was the background to your question? Explain what it was that you were getting at.
Well, 3 years ago, when Theresa May was Home Secretary, I came to the House to raise with her serious concerns that I had about the way in which the whip's offices had operated in the past, and warned her that those same practices may well persist now if left untackled. It came about because I'd seen a documentary where a Tory former whip had given an interview where he talked about covering up indiscretions in a little black book that were then used to demand loyalty from Tory MPs. And in that same interview, the former Home Secretary, Willie Whitelaw, had also made similar comments about the existence of these black books.
But that was, I think, way back in the 70s. Is it your implication that's still going on, Lisa Nandy?
So the concern that I posed to Theresa May 3 years ago was that unless she gave a child abuse inquiry, which she'd established the power to demand these papers, we wouldn't be able to discover what had led to that situation being able to persist for so long, and we wouldn't then be able to learn lessons for the future to make sure that we didn't repeat these practices in the present day. In the end, sexual abuse and sexual assault is about power. It's not just about sex, as some of the newspapers seem to think. It's actually about power and bullying and secrecy, and creating an environment in which that's allowed to persist. Oh, yeah. And the question that I asked to Theresa May 3 times 3 years ago was, would she act to make sure that those papers were disclosed and that real action was taken? She didn't do anything about it at the time. I hope that she will finally do something now.
All right. Well, thank you for coming straight from the chamber to speak to us, Lisa Nandy, there in the central lobby. You've been in the whip's office more recently.
And Lisa was an opposition whip, I believe, at the time.
And I think before we went to PMQs, you were saying they don't do this anymore?
No, I mean, this may or may not relate to practices back in the 70s. I mean, it was well before both of our times in politics. I can categorically assure everybody that there is no little black book, and any allegations.
There's no black book now?
No. Any allegations.
Not even virtually?
We have spreadsheets.
Well,
we have information. But any allegation of any form of impropriety, particularly if it involves any criminal allegations, are taken straight to the police. And I would hope in the Shadow Whip's office, where Lisa, I believe, worked, the same thing applies.
Well, it was clear in the past that that wasn't the case, and no doubt we'll find out if it is now.
That's all, folks.